I'm here with Sharon the Rebel
Hello?
outside a Christian Science building which has nothing to do whatsoever with creationism or Scientology. This is the Church of Christ Scientist, which, if you don't know, this is the church that believes in the science of prayer. You don't have to go to the doctor, just pray about it. Although some of them do go to the doctor, don't they?
Yes, only if they're at the very, very last option.
Yeah, so I'm intrigued to see how a church that's been around since 1870 has kept going when obviously there's been some controversy surrounding, isn't there? There's people, including children, who've died
Oh,
because
yeah,
they had various illnesses and they were prayed over instead of the parents seeking medical advice.
yeah. Instead of there was quite a famous case. It's the 90s, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Was it 90s?
I think in the 80s they were prosecuted in 1990. That was
Yeah,
the Twitchells.
yeah.
There was a couple in
Mm,
America who their son had abdominal pains, and they just got somebody from the church
mm,
over, from the Christian Science Church. They called him a practitioner, to pray over him. And of course, he didn't get any better. He got a lot worse, and
mm,
the poor little kid died at 2 years of age.
yeah. But the interesting thing about the court case was the judge omitted a law. But there's a law in America that states if you're a Christian Scientist and you believe that your practitioner, that there's scriptures that you read, if you believe that that is good enough, um, then that is good enough in their eyes. But the judge omitted to tell the jurors in the case the law, and some of the jurors actually, if they'd have known this law, they would have changed the outcome
Yeah.
because they got found guilty, didn't they?
Yeah, of manslaughter. And they're
Yeah.
not the only ones. I
Mm.
mean, since the 1880s, I think up to the 90s, that case,
Mm.
and probably since then, there's been quite a lot. Um, I don't know if we'll put that to any of the Christian Scientists in
Mm.
here or anything at all, but we're going to see a lecture, which they give lectures once or twice a year, and the public are free to come, and they're just going to talk about Christian Science and how it works. And we might have to talk to the lecturer afterwards, don't you think?
Yeah, I think we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, this could be interesting.
First of all, I hope that nobody here is confusing Christian Science with Scientology. That's a common misconception, but the two are really not alike at all. Unlike Scientology, Christian Science is based entirely on the Bible. Science is the study of something. Christian Science is the study of the Christ, the study of the life and teachings of Christ Jesus. Christian Science also fits the definition of science given in Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. Here's part of that definition. Science is a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through use of the scientific method. So, general truths, the operation of general laws. Earth science studies laws governing the earth in order to understand and apply those laws for the benefit of humanity. Computer science studies laws governing computers, the laws of circuitry and logic, in order to understand and apply those laws for the benefit of humanity. Christian Science studies the laws of God, divine laws, in order to understand and apply those laws for the benefit of humanity. That definition I read talked about something called the scientific method. Now, that's probably a term that all of us here have heard at one point. I think they're teaching the scientific method of research now in the first 5 or 6 years of formal schooling. But for those of you who haven't studied about this for a while, let me remind you what the 6 steps are in the scientific method. Step 1 is ask a question. Step 2, do some research. Step 3, form a hypothesis. 4, test the hypothesis through experimentation. 5, analyze the results. And 6, publish the results. I read an interesting article one time in a newspaper that talked about the Royal Society of London. The Royal Society is a professional scientific organization. And it seems that they had posted for the first time on their website a facsimile of a rare book written by 18th century archaeologist William Stukely. Stukely, it turns out, is a contemporary of Sir Isaac Newton. And Newton, you may recall, discovered, among other things, the law of gravity. So I went to the website and I found a place in this book where Stukely talked about a conversation he'd had with Isaac Newton, in which Newton told him what he thought when he saw the apple fall from the tree that led to his discovery of the law of gravity. Apparently that really happened. Isaac Newton was sitting in a grove of apple trees when he saw an apple fall, and here's what he said he thought. Why should that apple always descend perpendicularly to the ground? Why should it not go sideways or upwards, but constantly to the earth's center? Assuredly, the reason is that the earth draws it. So he went on to tell Stukely that he described what he was seeing in mathematical terms, and then he tested his math by looking at the motions of the planets in the solar system. And once he felt that his math was accurately describing what he was observing, then he published this law of gravity for all the world to use. Now, what particularly caught my eye about this article in the newspaper was what the present-day librarian of the Royal Society of London said about that passage in the book. He called it a good example of the scientific method. Well, I have always thought of the discovery of Christian Science as having followed the scientific method. So I'd like to take a few minutes now and talk about how the discoverer of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy, applied the scientific method in her discovery. Who remembers the first step in the scientific method?
Ask a question.
Yes, ask a question or ask a question. I prefer that. And the question Mary Baker Eddy asked was, where is true healing found? She grew up in the mid-1800s in a family of Congregationalists. They loved God and they loved the Bible. In her family, they read it every day. She also was rather frail and sickly as a child, and this condition continued well into her adulthood. But rather than this turning her away from God, she sought even more earnestly to understand God's role in healing. And she did this while investigating various methods of treatment, which took her to the second step of the scientific method, doing some research. She investigated not only conventional medical treatment, but Mrs. Eddy also investigated other forms of treatment that were available at that time, like homeopathy, hydropathy or water therapy, mesmerism. And she did find some measure of help through each of these different methods of treatment. But she didn't find permanent cure. And she also failed to see God's role in these different methods. And this left her wondering about all of those stories she loved in the Bible in which people were healed through prayer alone. During this time, Mrs. Eddy not only received homeopathic treatments, but she also administered them. And she later called one of the cases that came to her a falling apple on her road to discovery, making reference to Newton's experience. This was a case of a woman who had been diagnosed with dropsy, or an abnormal retention of fluid. Mrs. Eddy prescribed for her the same medication, the same dosage that the previous homeopath had prescribed. But she started to become concerned that a prolonged use of this particular drug would have an adverse effect on the patient. But the patient refused to give up the drug. So Mrs. Eddy started giving her unmedicated doses. She watched her very carefully, of course, because she didn't want there to be an adverse effect for another reason. But the woman continued to improve. After a while, the patient said that she would try giving up the drug. But on the third day, she relapsed, and she said she couldn't get along without it. So Mrs. Eddy started giving her the unmedicated doses again, and the woman started to improve again. And ultimately, she completely recovered under that regimen. This case proved to Mrs. Eddy that it was not the drug, but the woman's faith in the drug that had cured her. There was also another case of healing that Mrs. Eddy later called a falling apple, which then led to the next step in the scientific method, forming a hypothesis. And this was the case of her own healing in 1866. She was walking on the icy streets of Lynn, Massachusetts, when she slipped and fell. And it must have been a terrific tumble, because a local newspaper at that time reported that she was taken up in an insensible condition to a nearby home. The next day, she was moved to her own home and pronounced in critical condition. After several days of being treated by a physician, she was diagnosed as having suffered severe internal injuries, and the doctor gave up hope that she would live. In her extremity, Mary Baker Eddy asked for her Bible. While she was reading an account of Jesus healing someone, she gained a deep insight into the nature and reality of being. So much so that she got up from her bed, she got dressed, she walked into the next room where her friends were astonished to see her recovered. She later wrote, "I was ever after in better health than I had before enjoyed." The days of her being an invalid were over. Well, just as Isaac Newton had pondered what had happened with that apple, that falling apple, Mary Baker Eddy pondered what had happened to her. And just as he had done, she formed a hypothesis, and it was this: that spiritual healing of sickness and sin, as Christ Jesus practiced it, is based on universal divine laws that can be learned and applied today. Here's what she wrote about that experience. "I knew the principle of all harmonious mind action to be God, and that cures were produced in primitive Christian healing by holy, uplifting faith. But I must know the science of this healing." So she continued her research, now focusing intensely on the Bible. She was convinced of the truth she had glimpsed, that she knew that she needed to understand it better so that she could explain it clearly to others. She also knew that she shouldn't publish her theories and her deductions until she had thoroughly proven them. So she moved to the next step in the scientific method, testing through experimentation. There are many, many healings documented throughout this period of Mary Baker Eddy's life. I'll just share a few of them with you here. And these were not just minor ailments, but they ran the full range of physical difficulty and disease. For example, there was a woman who wrote to Mrs. Eddy that a large timber had crushed the bones of her foot, and she asked for a prayer treatment. Mrs. Eddy gave her one, and the woman reported that she was restored at once She said, "That very day I put on my boot and walked several miles." In another case, Mrs. Eddy's prayers cured an entire family very quickly. The father was healed of rheumatism, the son was healed of a disease of the bowels, and the daughter was healed of deafness. All of these cases had been given up as incurable. In later years, Mrs. Eddy was asked how healings like that were accomplished, and she replied, "It is love that heals, only love." And by this, she meant the love that is God. She always gave God the credit as the healer. Then there was a man who was diagnosed with enteritis and bowel stoppage. When the medical community felt there was nothing more they could do for him, he asked for somebody to send for Mrs. Eddy. Her prayers cured him that day. This particular case was reported in a Boston newspaper, and it was called a remarkable case, not only because of the physical healing, but also because the man had undergone a complete character transformation. His wife said the thing she was most grateful for was his radical change morally and spiritually. As Mrs. Eddy moved to the next step in the scientific method, analyzing the results of her work, she realized that, as this last case illustrated, people were not only being healed physically, but they were being renewed morally and spiritually. Ultimately, she came to see that all Christian healing must be accompanied by a renewed sense of oneself, because the true healing is mental. And this is consistent with stories in the Bible in which people's names were sometimes even changed to denote their change in character. For example, Jacob was renamed Israel, Simon became Peter, and Saul was renamed Paul. She also found that people were healed most readily when they gave themselves wholeheartedly to her teachings, wholeheartedly to Christian Science treatment. Conventional medical treatment begins from the premise that there is a broken body, a broken physical body that has to be fixed. Christian Science treatment begins from the premise that God's children, created spiritually, are already perfect. And our task is to understand this more clearly. You can see that these are two competing points of view. Mrs. Eddy found that not only was Christian healing sufficient to effect a cure, but she found that it also worked best alone. Now, she never expected anybody to turn from another method of treatment involuntarily. Nobody practicing Christian Science then or now would be asked to do that. But she did find that trying to effect healing from two opposite points of view actually tended to work against both methods of treatment. Once Mrs. Eddy felt that she was having consistent success in her own healing practice, she realized there was one more thing necessary before she published her results, the last step in the scientific method. She reasoned that if indeed her healing work was accomplished through the application of universal law, that she ought to be able to teach this law, these rules, to others, and they ought to be able to repeat her healing work. So she began taking students. Some students were more successful than others, as is the case in any scientific endeavor. But there was consistent progress in the growth of Christian Science and in the number of cases healed as a result of its practice. So after 9 years of research and practical application, Mrs. Eddy felt that she had proved the truth of her hypothesis, that spiritual healing of sickness and sin, as Christ Jesus practiced it, is based on universal divine laws that can be learned and applied today. So she published her findings in this book. It's called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, first published in 1875. And she didn't just rest on her laurels after publishing this either. She continued healing and teaching throughout the rest of her life. She modified Science and Health hundreds of times, always looking for better, clearer ways to explain her discovery. And she taught hundreds of students. Ultimately, she formed a board of education, which continues today, offering classes in learning about the science of Christianity. Over the years, I've been asked how I reconcile my practice of Christian Science with my background in what is typically called hard science. I actually find that my background can be helpful. After all, we've been talking about the scientific method. There actually is a place in Science and Health in which Mary Baker Eddy gives the spiritual sense of the scientific method in 3 steps: divine revelation, reason, and demonstration. I'd like to take just a minute and talk about each of those. First, revelation. You may be interested to know that Mrs. Eddy included proof as an aspect of revelation. She never felt that she could reconcile any spiritual concept that had come to her through divine revelation unless she could validate it through practical application. This concept of revelation is not a huge leap for me as a physical scientist. Remember, I said one of the things I love about science is how it asks us to look beyond what we can see. Newton looked beyond the falling apple. Scientists using the Hubble Space Telescope looked beyond darkness. They trained the telescope on a dark region of the sky, a region where nothing appeared to be, hypothesizing that there actually was something there if they could just look deeply enough into space. Sure enough, thousands of never-before-seen stars and galaxies became evident. Similarly, Christian Science teaches that a deeper look into the realm of infinite divine love reveals the nature of God and his love for his creation. And this deeper look into the spiritual cosmos is made evident through transformed lives, including physical healing. The second of this 3-step summary of the scientific method is reason. All scientists reason through things logically. Computer science is all about logic and reasoning. Isaac Newton reasoned that the phenomenon of the falling apple could be explained through universal laws. Mary Baker Eddy reasoned that the phenomenon of Christian healing could be explained through universal laws. It does take logic and reasoning in order to apply these laws for healing, and I'll explain more in just a minute about how I've done that. But first, the third of this 3-step summary of the scientific method is demonstration, proof. All scientists require proof, and I'm no different. I don't study Christian Science because somebody told me I had to. In fact, I tell people that the interesting question in my case is not how I started studying Christian Science, because I grew up in it. But the interesting question for me is why I stay with it. And I stay with it because I've seen it work. I see its relevance and its effectiveness in my life. Or in scientific speak, I have my own evidence that supports what Christian Science claims to be. For example, one time I was baking cookies. While I was baking cookies, I was thinking about a friend of mine, but I'm sorry to say not in very complimentary terms. I was pretty annoyed with this friend. While I was in the midst of all of this mental turmoil, I went to take a fully baked tray of cookies out of the oven, but I forgot to use an oven mitt. By the time I realized what I'd done, my hand was seriously burned, and I was in a great deal of pain. Now, what I did in response to this situation was the most natural thing in the world for me. I called a Christian Science practitioner. A practitioner is somebody who is devoted full-time to helping others through prayer. After I told this experienced Christian Scientist what had happened, she said to me very firmly, "The flame shall not hurt you." I recognized those words as being from an old Protestant hymn, an arrangement of which is in the Christian Science hymnal. But I also realized what she was doing was stating a spiritual law. And her point was this law applied to me. Her words, "The flame shall not hurt you," reminded me that my true identity is spiritual, not material. That my true body is the body of my thought. Christian Science teaches that God's children are spiritual ideas of the divine mind, or God. And I knew that a spiritual idea could not be touched by a material flame. I knew that in a very real sense, I had a choice to make. I could either accept that the physical law of the oven flame governed that situation, or I could rely on spiritual law, which supersedes and annuls physical law. And because of the many times, many times, that I had relied on spiritual law to good effect, I chose spiritual law. So this practitioner agreed to pray with me about this. We hung up and I went to the hymnal and I looked up that hymn. Here is the full verse. "When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace," that is God's grace, "all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine." Well, this definitely seemed like a fiery trial, as the hymn put it. And I was reminded of that story in the Bible about the 3 Hebrew men who were thrown into the burning, fiery furnace. Their trust in God was so complete. Their understanding of their inseparability from divine life was so great that not only were they not burned, but their clothes were not burned. The smell of fire didn't even pass on to them. And I found this very encouraging. For about the next 15 or 20 minutes, I just held tenaciously to this concept of myself as spiritual. Not spiritual and material, but only a spiritual idea of God, inseparable from Him. And after about 20 minutes, I was so grateful to be able to call the practitioner back and tell her that there had been significant progress. The pain had diminished, although it wasn't completely gone. And the hand, which had seemed quite abnormal in both appearance and function, was rapidly returning to a more normal state. Now, while I was talking to her the second time, I started berating myself for having had those unloving thoughts about my friend. And she interrupted me and again said very firmly, "You never had an unloving thought." Well, that was in complete opposition to what I'd been thinking when I was baking cookies. But I realized again what she was doing was stating a spiritual law, and her point was this law applied to me. It was logical to me that God as love, and only love, could never hate, and could never create a child who could hate. I thought about that hymn again. I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. You know, the dross is that waste material that's sloughed off, and the refinement of precious metals. So I reasoned that in this case, the dross, that metaphorical dross to be consumed, was a false concept of myself as less than loving. And the gold to be refined was a right concept of myself and of my friend. I didn't want to leave out my friend. A right concept of both of us as loved, as loving, and as lovable. And as I thought about these things, all of that mental turmoil that I'd been feeling just simply washed away. And right along with it, the pain diminished until it was gone. The next time I looked at my hand, really looked at it, was several hours later, and it was perfect. There wasn't a mark on it, and I was able to use it normally in every way. I should also mention that my relationship with my friend also was restored immediately, restored like new, just like the hand. Now, some of you may wonder that I would so willingly turn away from the physical evidence like that. I'll tell you the truth. The most real moments of my life, the most compelling moments, have not been revelations of physical science or a brilliantly executed piece of software code, although those things are rewarding. They are. But the most rewarding, the most compelling, the most real moments have been revelations of divine science. I have one more example which illustrates what I mean. One night I awoke with a stabbing pain in my side. It was not only annoying, but it was rather alarming. And I tossed and I turned for a while, and finally I got up and I opened this book on my bedside table. It was a book about Christian Science written by Baker Eddy. I opened it and I read just one sentence, and suddenly I had this brilliant flash of spiritual illumination. The only way that I can think to describe it is to say that I glimpsed absolute truth. What became so clear to me in that moment is that God's universe is the only universe there is. It's entirely spiritual, and it's entirely harmonious, without any bitterness or hatred or discord of any kind. It was crystal clear to me. At once, the pain was gone. It was so sudden that it startled me, physically and mentally. It was a jolt. Who I was, my concept of my place in the universe, just changed in an instant. And this healed me physically, instantly. That moment of divine consciousness, of spiritual clarity, that glimpse of absolute truth, stands out as a beacon to me in my life. And I cannot ignore it. I've wanted to. I confess I've wanted to more than once, but I cannot. It is evidence that is more real to me as a scientist than anything else I have ever experienced. Now, if I'm not getting the results that I'm looking for, or I have trouble applying the teachings of Christian Science, I don't abandon the science, but I do question the application. It's like math. Just because sometimes I had trouble working problems in calculus or using imaginary numbers. And yes, there is such a thing as imaginary numbers in math. I didn't dismiss the whole of mathematics as foolish. Rather, I realized that there were other problems I'd been able to work, there were other principles I had been able to apply, and others had been able to work these problems. And I knew if I could just understand the principles that lay behind these problems better and practice applying them, that I, too, would be able to work the problems at hand. Similarly, these glimpses of absolute truth, along with the body of other evidence I've gleaned over the years through healing, through my study and application of Christian Science, along with the many, many other healings I know of by others who have practiced Christian Science over the last 140 years, all of these things tell me that there is actually something to this science, and it makes me want to learn more. There is one more main point that I would like to make this afternoon. It is true that in the practice of Christian healing, there are no thermometers or wind gauges or blood pressure measurements, but Christian scientists do gauge thought. Jesus said to the man at the pool of Bethesda, "Wilt thou be made whole?" Wasn't he asking the man to measure where his thought was? Wasn't he really asking him, are you willing to be made whole? Very often when Jesus would heal someone physically, he would say something to them like, "Go and sin no more," or "Be not afraid." First and foremost, he was addressing thought. Now, the connection between thought and physical healing cannot be measured physically. But that's what people are always trying to do, trying to devise some sort of medical test in order to validate prayer. But I contend that it can't be done, because prayer and its effect can be measured only by spiritual sense, or what I call the Christ Spirit. Jesus, the man, was here for a short time. But the Christ, which motivated all of his healing and teaching, Christ is eternal. Paul wrote about this to the Corinthians. He said, "Eye have not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. God hath revealed them unto us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searcheth all things, yea, the deep things of God." The Spirit that Paul is talking about is the Christ Spirit. Christ is what enabled me to overcome the fear of severe weather, to learn to love my friend better, to glimpse absolute truth. If this seems esoteric, think about it. We don't see wind or friction or gravity, but we see and feel the effects from these things. The love of a child is real and tangible, but you can't measure that physically. Or think about music for a minute. Say that you have two pianists, two musicians. They sit down to play a piece of music, the same piece of music at different times at the same piano. And let's say they get all the notes right, all the rhythm correct, technically perfect. One of those performances may leave you feeling cold and unmoved. The other performance may absolutely uplift and transport you. The difference in those performances is not the notes on the page or the piano. It's the inspiration of the musician. You can't measure that physically, but you know when it's there, when it's not. Again, what I love about science is how it asks us to look beyond what we can see. Did you know that in astronomy, the farther out you look in space, the farther back in time you go? The farther out you look in space, the farther back in time you're seeing. Now that is a cool and mind-bending concept. Those galaxies that were discovered by the Hubble Space Telescope were thought to be among the oldest in the universe, 12 to 13 billion years old. And we were able to see those because the Hubble telescope can look so far into space. But the measurement of time and space, even vast amounts of time and vast amounts of space, is still a finite proposition. Whereas looking at the universe through the lens of Christian Science reveals infinity and eternity. And for me, that's the coolest concept of all. The discovery of Christian Science introduced a whole new way of looking at the universe, which makes other theories obsolete. That's why my study of meteorology didn't help me overcome the fear of severe weather. My study of Christian Science did. It gave me a whole new way of looking at what I was measuring as cause and effect. By the way, I've been asked if one has to have a background in science in order to study Christian Science. The answer is emphatically no. Christian Science is for everybody, regardless of your profession or your background. Intellectual proficiency is not required, but as Mary Baker Eddy put it, sound morals are most desirable. She also wrote, regardless of what another may say or think on this subject, I speak from experience. And she did speak from experience, decades of experience, of applying universal divine laws for the benefit of humanity. And I also speak from decades of experience, which support what Christian Science teaches. Let me leave you with this thought. One of the things I have always loved about Christian Science from the time I was a little girl is that Mary Baker Eddy never asked us to take what she said at face value. She wrote, "You can prove for yourself, dear reader, the science of healing, and so ascertain if the author has given you the correct interpretation of Scripture. Proving it for yourself is what any good scientist would do." So I thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Hello there,
Hi.
fellow American here.
Oh, yay!
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi, are you also American?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay, all right.
I've been here a long time, though, so I'm well familiar with this church. So I was just keen on hearing about the whole thing, Christian Science and all that. We did a little bit of research about it. You know, we know a bit about Mary Baker Eddy and the accident she had and all that.
Right.
You know, but it just needed to fill in the gaps, really. You know.
Was this helpful?
Yeah.
To fill in the gaps a little bit? Oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
great.
it's really fascinating. You know what you were saying about we're born perfect.
Yes.
And it's like we're spiritual
Right.
in a way. So does that mean the whole original sin thing of the Bible doesn't apply?
Yes, that's what it
in
means.
this-
And that is one way in which Christian Science is different than a lot of traditional Christian religions, because this whole idea that man is a sinner and is not valid. In the teachings of Christian Science, it's kind of a whole other kind of long story about Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2. I mean, Bible scholars have agreed that there are like two accounts of creation in the early book of Genesis.
It does seem to be,
Yeah, because one, you've got Genesis 1, which we think of as the one creation, and that's entirely spiritual, even though it talks about beasts of the field and all that, it's a spiritual concept of these things. Then Genesis 2, when it says, "But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground," and now we have Adam and Eve, which we think of as not so much the reality of the history of human beings, but an allegory, much like an object lesson in what happens when you get off track. You're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, therefore you have misery and sorrow. But that can be turned around, like this. But that's the false picture of man. But the real picture, the reality is the spiritual creation in which we literally are wholly spiritual. And I'll just be honest with you, that whole time that I was praying about that burned hand, and I was, here's what I thought to myself. I thought, okay, I am either going to really rely wholeheartedly on Christian Science, or I'm going to the emergency room, because that's how serious it seemed. And I thought, all right, if I'm going to call myself Christian Science, if I'm going to really know that this heals, I am going to rely on it completely. So I wasn't, how I said I was tenaciously holding on to this concept of myself as a spiritual idea. Well, I was practically shouting it, I am spiritual, I am not material. It wasn't like I was trying to hypnotize myself. It was like I was shouting down the argument to the opposite effect, which was, you really burn that hand, it looks really bad, and this is, what are you, crazy? Of course you're material, can't you tell? It was really just this mental argument and battle that I was having. But at some point during that 15 minutes, there was a moment, when I started to realize. I'll tell you, I started to realize I was being healed, and it was just almost imperceptible right at first. But there was a shift in my thinking, and a shift in the physical condition, and then I realized, then it was easier for me to hold to that.
But you said it took a few hours for your hand to, didn't you say that?
It took only about 20 minutes for me to realize that I was on the upswing. And then I was almost immediately able to use my hand mostly. But there was still quite a bit of pain, even though it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been. So then it was maybe a couple of hours more that the pain just kept diminishing and diminishing. And then
how would you call that healing, though? A skeptic would say, "Oh, it's going to get better anyway."
Because this was the kind of thing, like when I looked at my hand, like for example, the next morning, there was no mark on it. Now that is not conventional wisdom according to the medical community. It would have been bad news, and scarred and all kinds of stuff, but there was none of that. So for me, that was quite convincing, and it was, but the hand was like getting out of shape and weird stuff like that. But within a half an hour, that whole thing had been reversed. So for me, it was really convincing.
Imagine if you had been, chopping vegetables or something, and off your finger goes.
Yeah. Well,
would you have applied the same technique? Are there Christian scientists who do that?
I actually know a guy who did that. He was chopping wood, and he somehow chopped off the top of his finger, like not just the top, but all the way down, And he, this is a guy who had not been in Christian Science that long, but long enough to know that he just really believed in the healing power of it, and he'd had other healings and things. And when this happened, he was, it freaked him out, and he was, I think he passed out. And somebody took him to the hospital, and he woke up in the hospital, and they they didn't. I don't think they had the finger. I don't even think they could put it back on. And he just really. I don't remember all the details, but after a couple of days, he decided that he just really wanted to get out of the hospital and rely on Christian Science alone. And so they let him finally sign himself out, and he said that I'm trying to remember the details. He worked with a Christian Science practitioner for about a week, and at that point, I mean, he was really struggling spiritually and everything, for about a week. But then he felt that he could take up the work himself better, and so for I think he said it was 45 days, and his finger completely grew back. And he was there. I mean, look, I just know enough about healing and Christian Science to believe this guy. And so, yeah, but there also have been other people. I know of another case where there was a guy who had some kind of accident with a saw, and he sliced essentially all his 4 fingers. And in that case, he and his wife went to the hospital, and a surgeon sewed the fingers back on. Maybe I think it was more than one finger. But anyway, however many it was, doesn't matter. After the surgery, he really wanted to rely on Christian Science for the completeness of the healing. The diagnosis, the prognosis was that he might have some limited use of the fingers, but not, full use. And this was particularly difficult for him because he was a violinist. This was his, string fingers.
Yeah.
And so I don't know actually the whole story, but what I know of it, he went to a Christian Science nursing facility just to be able to pray and rehabilitate, whatever. And at a Christian Science nursing facility, they don't administer drugs or diagnose or do surgery or anything like that. It's just practical care, bandaging and toileting and helping with mobility and washing and all that. And I don't remember, he said there were 2 things that were the turning point. I don't remember what one of them was, but the other one was this nurse came in, and of course Christian Science nurses are also Christian Scientists, and they're meant to help people who are relying on Christian Science for healing. So she was completely supportive of what he was doing, and he had this giant bandage on his hand. And at some point, in a regular dressing change, she took off this bandage, and she just put on a couple of little Band-Aids on it, and he's like, what is the matter with you, in so many words, right? And her whole, it wasn't even so much what she said, it was her whole attitude of, oh, well, we'll just put on a little Band-Aid here. This was not the huge thing that he was thinking it was, right? Because she was so elevated. And for him, that was a turning point. Well, okay, so I don't know how long it had been, weeks, maybe a couple months, I'm not sure. And he had somebody come visit him in this nursing facility who was a budding violinist where they weren't very good. And so he was sitting there, and they said, well, I want to play for you, oh, won't that be nice? And he said, oh, that will be nice, yes, please do. And but he was also feeling, because he couldn't play, so this was a little bit of a stretch for him to listen to somebody play for him. So this person was playing, and it was dreadfully bad. Even though they were trying, it was sincere, and it was really bad. And at one point, without even thinking about what he was doing, he said, no, give that to me, let me show you. And he started to play. And it was only, after he had been playing for, a few months that he realized what he had done, and that he was able to use these fingers completely, apparently. And so he, had that. But what one person does in a situation, for example, broken bones, I know some Christian Scientists go have those set, and some have been completely healed through, multiple fractures and stuff, just for prayer. But I think one of the things I also like about Christian Science is that you can choose. It is understood that if you're a church member, if you really have committed yourself to Christian Science, whether you're a church member or not, that your first resort is prayer. As opposed to thinking of that as maybe something you might do in addition to. Or, if this doesn't work, I'll go to the doctor. Although you're free to do that, You know, I have as a practitioner, I have people say to me, you know what, after working a couple of days or a week or whatever, you know, I think I'm going to go to the doctor. Okay, fine. You know, I never tell somebody what to do. Or I'll get calls from people who said, well, I've been to the doctor, I'm not feeling any help. Can you pray for me? You know, and we'll pray and they'll find healing. So it's all over the map, you know, on how people apply it or don't. Do you have a copy of Science and Health?
No.
Oh, well, we need to make sure, I'll hook you up with these people out here to make sure that you can get 1 or 2 copies if you'd each like a copy. And I honestly didn't know. I often will say at the end of a lecture, if you want a copy, you can get one. I assume that I know there's a reading room here, so I know you have.
Well, it's definitely going to have a look.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, let's go.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have anything else you wanted to ask immediately?
I just wonder how do things work? Like with existing medical conditions, like say someone's diabetic, would you then say, okay, you should not take your insulin, just go to hospitals, or that's what I kind of struggle with.
Okay, and that's a reasonable question. So, as a practitioner, I am never going to tell somebody what to do, whether to take medicine or a Christian Science treatment. I mean, if you want me to pray for you, then if you just want to talk about ideas and have me pray in sort of a generic way, okay, I can do that. But to have me actually treat you, you would need to be off the insulin. But sometimes people will call and say, well, I really want to be off the insulin. I don't know if I can. Can you pray with me? And we'll just take it a day at a time to see how it goes. If there's a sincerity there, yes, of course, I'll pray with that person for that. I can tell you about, there's a testimony actually in the back of Science and Health. The last 100 pages of the book are testimonies by people who were healed just by reading it. And so one of those, and they're all written like around 1900, so that old-timey language. But this one woman, I always use this example in answering this question. She had whatever her illness was. She was on all this medication, and she sort of hid Science and Health, as I recall, under her pillow, because she didn't want her family thought she was nuts, and so she kind of read it, And so she was lying in bed one day and reading this book, and suddenly, she had one of those glimpses of absolute truth, right? And she just thought, I do not need this medicine anymore. It was, just like this, and she was so convinced of it that she literally reached over to the bedside table, took the medicine, and threw it out the open window. And, for her it was like, boom, and she never looked back. And I feel like it should be almost like that. If somebody is on this medication that they're supposed to use all the time, I tell people, Mrs. Eddy uses a phrase, to emerge gently from matter to spirit. You do it when you feel compelled, and it can be in a flash, like that woman, or it can be something you worked toward for a long time. There was a guy who had some kind of surgery and was told that he had to be on some medication for the rest of his life. It turns out he was a Christian Scientist, and he had chosen to have surgery. And that we prayed about that, because he didn't want to have to be a slave to the medication, and he really wanted to be free from it, and he completely is and has been for years. And so it just, again, it's individual. I have 2 people here that would like to get copies of Science and Health. Can you help them with that?
I can indeed.
Oh, yes. Good. So this is Richard. You can go with him, and he'll set you up.
Yeah, we'll sort it out.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, very much.
Okay, so nice to meet you both.
Good. Would you like one each?
Actually, I'd like one, yeah.
There we are. And then at the back, the chapter of fruitage, there's the whole 100 pages of healings which came about just through.
Oh yeah, Mary
reading.
was saying about the testimonies at the back.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So they're well worth a look. And
Yeah.
then
So you read when you have your talk, or it's not really a sermon, is it? On a Sunday, you read from the Bible, and you have this.
we read from the Bible and Science and Health
together.
Read the Bible first, citations, and then from Science and Health things which are related,
Yeah.
sort of explaining some of the Bible passages. Yeah.
So do you think the Bible actually needs this, as it were?
I think we need it.
Yeah.
In the sense that, I mean, some of the Bible passages are quite difficult to understand, and I think looking at the Bible, there's, as it were, a historical perspective to it, but behind that, we see a spiritual perspective, and this really opens one's eyes to the spiritual perspective.
So do you see Mary Baker Eddy as sort of like almost like a prophet or a visionary in some way who's clarifying the Bible in some way?
No, I don't think. I mean, I don't think she would want to be looked at in that way. But just as the leader of the Christian Science movement, and as an outstanding woman who healed and gave us the Science and Health and other writings.
So do you think it was her discoveries? What she discovered?
This is her discovery. Yeah. It's in there. This is what she discovered.
So do you think that's what? So she just wanted to share it with us?
That's right. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I think that was really, in many ways, what she lived for, to share the discovery with others. And we can just be very grateful that she didn't just keep it to herself.
Have you personally been healed by anything through the methods?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I mean, I had sprained ankle at one stage, which was healed very, very quickly.
Yeah.
I had more recently a bloodshot eye, which again was dealt with in a couple of days or so. So yeah, I had that sort of thing going on.
Okay.
So I would certainly.
But you'd still go to the hospital if like something major, if you had like an appendicitis attack or something like that.
I suppose as an individual one would find it very difficult to answer that question, because I certainly know individuals, or I know one individual anyway, who certainly had appendicitis and did not go to hospital and was healed through Christian Science.
They had a practitioner come over?
I don't know. I don't know all the details, but yeah, I'm sure the individual was being helped by a practitioner. So yeah.
I'm very interested to read it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Good. There we are. Good.
Okay, so that was our little foray into the world of Christian Science, and we had a speaker who obviously had come over from America who, although she is a scientist, I mean a real one.
proper scientist.
Yeah, worked on the Hubble telescope of all things. She also believes in the science of prayer. And it seems to work for her, because she burnt her hand on a cookie tray, and then through prayer it got better hours later.
Yeah. I struggle with this idea because she's an incredibly intelligent woman. Very, very nice lady. Very, very good speaker.
Yeah.
She's highly educated. She is a proper scientist.
Yeah.
We're talking about, to me, science is something that's proven. It's something that has a theory behind it. It has a practice. Science is fact, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's repeatable experiments, isn't it? I think she touched on that at one point, but I doubt if you can really do repeatable experiments in just prayer.
Yeah. Because where is the evidence to back it up?
Yeah. Well, their evidence are testimonies. My stomach hurt and then I prayed and it didn't hurt anymore. But,
Yeah, she burnt her hand and then hours later it's healed. But to me, that's not science, that's a miracle. I can't see how
or is it a miracle at all?
Yeah,
I mean, I think the same has happened to me, without any application of anything. I just waited a few hours.
Yeah. I've fallen over, I sprained my ankle, I've got up and walked, and it hurt at the time, and I probably did curse God and several other cursive words, but a few hours later it's fine, it's healed.
And I also detected a little bit of sort of like hero worship of their founder, Mary Baker Eddy. Yeah. This woman who'd healed herself in a hospital back in 1870, whatever it was, or 1860. And there's paintings of her on the wall, and there's quotes painted on the wall, and constant reference to her as if she was infallible.
Yeah.
And they read from her book along with the Bible.
Yeah, which we have copies of.
Yes, we've both got free copies, so that goes into the collection of weird and wonderful books, The Worlds of Religion. Yeah, and of course they said look at the back of the book, because there's 100 pages of testimonies of people who've been healed, all written in 1900 or something like that. She said, but I don't know. I can't really go by testimonies of people. I mean, the Bible's one big testimony, and it's Jesus then walked on water. I mean, okay,
It's
really.
There's no, you can't prove any of it. There's no proof of any of it. Science is proof based on theory, based on practice. It's proof, it's fact.
Yeah.
But with the Bible it's one man's word against well, who? Because who was around at the time? Who was around in the time when the Bible was written to say, oh yeah.
Yeah, none of it was written by eyewitnesses, and even if it was, I think I would still doubt a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of
But what do you say? Shall we visit the world of Christian Science again, maybe one day in the future?
I would love to. I must admit, halfway through, I was losing the will to live, and I think the lady in front of us was as well. I think she looked like she needed a bit of healing, but it's there's nothing. I didn't find anything insincere about it. I didn't find anything.
They believe it.
Yeah, I found like the original sin thing. In the Bible, everyone's born and we're already born sinners, but there wasn't here. Everyone is born. I get the impression that everyone is born pure, and it's all out of love, and it's. But I think there goes a lot.
So
deeper.
why do we have disease? We should have asked that. Really.
That's a very good point.
Why do we have it then? If it's not some sort of punishment or God's mistake of putting us on this planet where there is disease, and
I think that's an excellent point that we should have asked.
Absolutely, we'll save that for next time.